This is the Mercedes-AMG CLA45, and on paper, it's perfect. It has 355 horsepower, it has all-wheel drive, it has a lightning-quick dual-clutch automatic transmission, and it's not big or bloated. I love zippy little luxury cars like this. In fact, I said that the Audi RS3 is the best new Audi model. That's one of the CLA45's closest competitors. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the CLA45, and today I'm going to explain why. To start, I've rented this car using Turo, which is this service that lets you rent other people's cool and interesting cars instead of normal boring airport rental cars. You can sign up for Turo using the link in the video description below, and you'll get $25 off your first Turo rental. Now, I rented this AMG CLA45 here in Denver, and I'm home for the holidays visiting my family, and I chose to rent this car because back when the CLA45 first came out in 2014, I had the chance to drive an early version of it, and I absolutely loved it. It was just the perfectly sized German luxury sedan that also happened to be a fun sports car. It reminded me of a German version of the Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution. They took their base level car, the CLA, and they added all-wheel drive and a really fast transmission and a really boosted four-cylinder with 355 horsepower. And it's not even all that expensive. The CLA45 starts at around $50,000 compared to around $56,000 for the Audi RS3 and close to $60,000 for the BMW M2. And more importantly, used CLA45 models are starting to get really cheap, with a lot of early examples easily available for under $30,000. Unfortunately, after spending the week with the CLA45, I've changed my mind. And today, I'm going to explain why. First, I'm going to take you on a thorough tour of this car, and I'm going to show you its quirks and features. Or should I say, its feature. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the CLA45, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of the best certified pre-owned Mercedes-Benz bargains currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Now, I'm going to start the discussion of the CLA45's quirks and features by talking through some of the features that this car is lacking. Okay, so when I went to get in it for the first time, I walked up to the door handle, pulled it, and it didn't open. This car doesn't have keyless go, which is Mercedes-Benz system where you keep the key in your pocket, you just walk up and the door automatically unlocks. Instead, in this car, you actually have to push the unlock button on your key fob and then stick the key into the ignition. You don't just press the button to start it. Now, I figured, okay, that's fine. That's an expensive option on some Mercedes-Benz models, even though this is, the top of the line CLA, the AMG version. It doesn't have keyless go. I can live with that. But then things got worse from there. Check this out. This car does not have automatic climate control. It just has a regular climate control system where you turn it to heat or cool, and then you turn the fan speed up for how much hot or cold air you want. You can't just set it to a temperature and let the car do the work, which is shocking in a car that's this expensive. Maybe more importantly, it doesn't have dual zone climate control, meaning the driver and passenger have their own different zones. You only get one climate zone in this car. Again, not that crazy, but a little surprising for a vehicle this expensive, but it gets even worse. As I looked around the interior, I realized this car has no sunroof. For over $50,000, you don't get a sunroof in your AMG Mercedes luxury car. Next, as I was poking around, another thing I discovered is that this car doesn't have heated seats. Now, being in Colorado, almost every luxury car is ordered with the heated seat option, but not this one. This is as base as it gets, even though it's the top of the line version of the CLA. But then things got even worse. I went into the infotainment system and I discovered this car does not have navigation. In a world where we all have navigation on our phones with a free app, you still have to pay extra for it, even if you get the nicest CLA. And worse than that, this car doesn't have a backup camera. Now, I admit this is a 2016 model, so it's a couple years old. And in 2017, Mercedes refreshed the CLA and they added a couple new features, but none of the ones I've just complained about, except for the backup camera, which they had to add because it was a mandated safety feature from the federal government. Now, the Honda CR-V, which costs half of what this does, has had a standard backup camera for years, but Mercedes made you pay extra for it until the government mandated it, and that is how German luxury cars screw you. I'm absolutely shocked how few luxury features this car has. Now, if I was in an actual Lancer Evolution, I wouldn't say anything about this stuff. It wouldn't even be noteworthy that it doesn't have keyless go or heated seats. But when you pay over 50 grand for a Mercedes and you opt for the AMG version, you at least should get a backup camera, and you shouldn't have to wait for a federal government mandate to do it. But it gets worse. What features does this car have? How about the fact that it has a lighted up Mercedes-Benz emblem on the grille, and when you open the door, there's a little light up Mercedes-Benz emblem that comes out of the door and projects onto the ground. So the owner of this car decided they wanted the Mercedes emblem to light up to prove to everyone that it was a luxury car, but they didn't want to spring for a backup camera or a sunroof or dual zone climate control. This is probably the most depressingly optioned car I have ever been inside in my entire life. It has all of the look at me, I'm cool options and none of the actual luxury features to back it up. And the problem is when you spend over 50 grand and Mercedes makes none of that stuff standard, you have to add it all back in with options. And by the time you do, you're more expensive than a base level Audi RS3, which includes a lot of those features and which has an additional 45 horsepower over this car. Again, this car is a couple years old, but the refresh didn't really address these issues with the lack of content in the CLA45. And besides just the features and options content of this car, there are some drawbacks to the interior of this vehicle. For example, look at this area around the shift lever. In a lot of Mercedes-Benz and AMG models, it's very nice. In this car, it's just really cheap plastic like you'd find in a Honda Civic. Same goes further down in the center console next to the cup holders. This looks like some sort of leathery vinyl thing, but it isn't. Again, it's just really cheap plastic. I also love the power seat controls. Now, kudos to Mercedes-Benz for putting power seats in this car, but take a look at the dummy switch for the headrest. It just reminds you that some Mercedes-Benz models have headrest controls, but not this one. Instead, you get a blank switch that's shaped like a headrest control that you don't have. But maybe my favorite example of Mercedes-Benz not even really trying in this car, we go back to the climate controls. You look at the climate controls and you'll see that the button to turn on the recirculating air inside this car doesn't show a picture of a car, but rather a van, which is just the most pathetic thing I've ever seen. These climate controls are so cheap and so basic, Mercedes figures most people won't even bother getting them in their cars, so they intend them to be used in their commercial vans. That's just ridiculous. Now, with all that said, Mercedes-Benz of course takes the chance at every opportunity they get to remind you that you've chosen an AMG model. There are AMG logos all over this car in all sorts of different places. I'm going to highlight two especially interesting ones, starting with the door locks. Now, I have an E63 AMG. I have normal door locks. This thing has like little AMG accessory door locks. It would really depress me to find out that the owner of this car paid extra for the door locks and didn't upgrade to a backup camera, but I fear that's exactly what may have happened. The other interesting item is those little puddle lamps that come out of the doors. It's actually a very interesting operation. In a lot of cars, they come out from the mirrors or from underneath the car, but in this vehicle, they're built into the little red light that lights up when you open the door. And so you can just sort of stick your hand under there and catch the logo from appearing on the ground, which is kind of cool. You can have the logo project onto your palm, which is something I would play with very frequently if I had this vehicle. Now, with all of those criticisms in mind, there are several things that I do like about the interior of this car, starting with the seats. This car has these nice grippy sport seats with Alcantara in the center. They look good, they feel good, and I really like them. I also like all the red accent stitching throughout the car. I think it could use a little bit more. There's no stitching on the dashboard, but there is nice stitching on the door panels, on the seats, on the center console, and this car has these cool little sporty red seat belts, which is a nice little touch that I like. Other things I like in this car, even though the upper part part of the dashboard is cheap and devoid of any stitching. I do like the lower part with this nice silver panel that goes all the way across, and I like these circular air vents. It looks a lot more upscale than this car actually is. I also like the fact that this car has park assist. Even though it doesn't have a backup camera, it does have Mercedes-Benz rather strange park assist feature where there's this little black panel mounted on the dashboard, on the roof, and as you get closer to something, these little lights light up in the panel to let you know how close you are. It does help a little bit with parking, even though quite frankly, a backup camera would help a lot more. Another thing I like is the interior size of this car. I'm 6'4", and I mention that because a lot of tall people are always writing me and asking me, hey, how tall are you? Can I fit in this car? And I'm happy to say that tall people can fit in this car very easily. The interior sizing is not excessive, but rather it's just right. And so if you need sort of a zippy little city-friendly performance luxury car that you can still fit in, this is a good example of that. And I also like this steering wheel in this car. It looks like a very nice AMG steering wheel, and in fact, it's the same wheel I have in my E63 AMG, which had a new sticker price of like twice what this car did. It's a nice looking steering wheel, feels good to touch, and looks good when you're looking at it. Next up, we move under the hood, and you can check out this car's engine. It's a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. Like I mentioned before, 355 horsepower, and also has around 330 pound-feet of torque. Those are actually really healthy numbers for a car this size. And I gotta hand it to Mercedes-Benz. I really like what they've been able to get out of this powertrain. This thing does 0 to 60 in like 4.6 seconds, which really does kind of make this seem like a German Evo. The other interesting thing about the engine is the fact that even though this is sort of a baby AMG car, it still has that little plaque on the engine cover telling you exactly who built this engine at Mercedes-AMG. Next, I'm moving around to the back of the CLA45. A couple of interesting things I want to talk about with the exterior, starting with the exterior styling. Now, the CLA will always have sort of the stigma of being the entry-level model, at least until the A-Class comes out here in North America. But I think Mercedes-Benz did a pretty good job styling this car. It's difficult to style the entry-level version and not make it look cheap and crappy and decontented, but that's what Mercedes did. It actually looks like a baby Mercedes, and I think it fits in well in this lineup. They did a good job designing this car. Now, the exterior of the CLA45 itself is relatively unremarkable compared to the standard CLA, although I do like the fact that, once again, even though this is the baby AMG car, it has quad exhausts, just like you would expect if you got an AMG 63 model. That's a nice little touch to make you feel special. One other interesting exterior item in this car is the mirror turn signals. A few Mercedes-Benz models have this. Very strange. A lot of car companies just put a little oval or square in the mirror for the turn signals, but Mercedes-Benz does these weird, like, two-fingered swoopy things for the mirrored turn signals. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm not sure if they're trying to make it look cooler or more interesting than a regular mirrored turn signal, but, well, I'm talking about it, so I guess they succeeded. Now, next we move into the trunk of the CLA45, where there are a couple of interesting items. One is the emergency inside trunk release. Now, by law, all cars have to have this, so if you try to kidnap someone, they can eject themselves from their trunk. And in most cars, it's just a little plastic handle that you pull to open the trunk, but in this car, it's this little green circle that has a light that pulses every second or two to let you know that if you get kidnapped by someone with a CLA45, that's how you get out of the trunk. Now, the other thing worth noting about the trunk in this car is that it's actually pretty big. Again, this is the entry-level Mercedes-Benz model in North America, at least for now, and yet they've done a pretty good job. The trunk in this car is nice and big and usable, and you can throw a lot of stuff in here, and frankly, that's pretty impressive. The packaging of this car must be pretty good to get both a lot of front interior room and a lot of trunk space into a car this size. Or at least, it's mostly good packaging. You see, you have a tiny car with a lot of interior space in the front and a big trunk, and you gotta take room out of somewhere, and where you take room out of in this car is the back seats. I'm sitting back here with the front seat almost all the way forward, and I barely have enough room for my knees, and it's even worse for the headroom in this car because Mercedes-Benz calls this a sedan coupe thingy. They slope the roof line, and so my head hits the top of the ceiling when I sit in the back of this car. It's really not an especially comfortable place to be back here. And in fact, I think there's less room in the back seat of this car than there is in the back of the Audi RS3. Now, the other drawback of the back seat of this car is the fact that just like the front seat, the rear of this car is shockingly decontented. Check this out. This car doesn't even have little storage pockets on the back of the front seats, which basically every car that I'm in has, even really cheap ones. This car also doesn't have rear climate controls. That's no surprise, but it doesn't even have rear climate vents. So the people sitting back here are sort of at the mercy of whatever the people in front decide to do for the climate control. Another surprising item in this car is missing the back seat. It doesn't even have a rear center armrest, which again you see in just about every car, let alone a $50,000+ Mercedes. Now, with that said, it does have a rear center seat. There are 3 seats back here. This is a bench, but the rear center passenger would probably be incredibly uncomfortable. Not only is the rear center seat incredibly tiny and narrow, but your legs end up on the center tunnel back here. There's really nowhere to put them and you have to straddle it. Sitting in the center in the back of this car is not a place you would want to spend any time. And by the way, you've probably noticed the unusual mat on the ground in this car. That's not some sort of new Mercedes-Benz floor mat. Instead, that's something the owner of this car, because he's renting it out, decided to put in this car, I guess to make sure that the floors stay clean. It's a little excessive if you ask me, but then again, some of the people who probably rent these cars probably aren't taking the best care of them, so you can never be too careful. And so those are the quirks and features, or rather the lack of features, of the Mercedes-AMG CLA45. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the CLA45. Now, there are a couple things I think that are worth noting about this car straight away. One is, in the right circumstances, on the right day, in the right road, in the right mode, this is one of the best cars on sale. And I mean that sincerely. If you put this car in sport mode and then you get on a really good curvy road and you're working the paddles and that transmission is shifting really fast, this thing is so fantastic to a level that no other car in this segment really is. It is just a total thrill to throw this thing around. I think it handles a little bit better than the RS3 at the limit. I love the exhaust note, which I think is surprisingly strong. It almost reminds me of the 500 Abarth. When you really push this thing around corners and really floor it and really go at it, I said earlier it's like a German Lancer Evolution. It really does feel like that. I'm sincere about that. The problem comes 99% of the time when you're just driving along in normal, regular, everyday driving. And specifically, the issues are these. Number one, the throttle response. I don't read a lot of car reviews because I don't want to sort of have it influence my opinion, so I'm not sure if anyone else has talked about this, but I find this to be a massive flaw with this car. There's no way to smoothly start from a stoplight. If you floor it, it jerks forward. If you just ease into it, nothing happens until you get to like half throttle, and then it jerks forward. It is one of the least smooth engine throttle situations that I have ever felt in any car. But another issue with this car is the ride quality. Now, I admit that the steering and handling in this car is absolutely fantastic. Even in comfort mode, Mercedes has done a great job making this car feel so tossable and so fun and so easy to just kick around and do whatever it is that you want. It really does feel great. But the excellent handling and the excellent steering in this car has unquestionably come at the expense of the ride quality. And it is actually difficult for me to drive this car just around. You just get beat up. I mean, most normal roads, it's fine, it's okay. You get to potholes though, and you're just like, oh, I really don't want to be in this thing anymore. It's a real challenge. But then you floor it on the right condition and it just feels so good. The throttle is instantly responsive when you're going for a mid-range acceleration. The steering and handling very sharp. Again, on back roads, this is a shockingly good car. Better than I ever would expect. Really, really good. But for the 99% of your driving that you're doing commuting, driving normally, the throttle, the ride quality, the materials, the features, to me, it really starts to become tedious. and cumbersome and annoying. And so that's the Mercedes-AMG CLA45. I love cars with this performance, with this pricing, and with this sizing. They remind me of the old Audi A4 that I had back in college before the A4 got big and bloated and luxurious. And I love the fact that this segment exists, the entry-level luxury high-performance cars. But the CLA45 is old now, and it shows. The Audi RS3 is absolutely worth the price premium over this car, and so is the BMW M2 if you can get by with only 2 doors. The CLA45 was great when it came out, but this segment has moved fast, and this car is now outclassed by its rivals. And now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the CLA45 looks nice, not gorgeous like a true sports car, but good given its sizing and practicality constraints, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is 4.6 seconds, and it earns a 6 out of 10. Handling is sharp for a car like this, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is reasonably high, given how exciting it is to toss around this car in the right circumstances, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Cool factor, though, is only okay. It's hard to make your base model car cool, even if you create a performance version, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a weekend score of 30 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features, and remember, I always score the actual car I drove. The CLA45 I reviewed was so low on tech it's laughable, and it gets a 5 out of 10, which is below anything else in this segment. Comfort was also weak given the harsh ride, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is decent. The interior is a mix of good and bad, but generally things seem screwed on well, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is average for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value. This car has a horrible value considering its equipment, but not so terrible given the performance and the price of its rivals. Still, it falls behind those rivals with a value score of 6 out of 10, giving it a daily score of 28 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 58 out of 100, which places it at the bottom of its segment, which is accurate since it's also the oldest car in its segment, and a redesigned CLA is coming sooner or later. The real surprise may be that it has a lower daily score than the BMW M2 competition, but it makes sense. The M2 competition has more tech, a much better value per dollar ratio, and a surprisingly slight concession for practicality given the CLA's small back seat.